Great question, because I could not even look at it for 2 years. I could not even look at a picture of her. I could not even think about reading her memoir. It was like every time I saw like her handwriting on something, I would lose it. And, my dad died when I was 56, and it was a very different grieving experience because I was younger. I was working really hard. I was like, okay, I'm going back to work. And that's how I dealt with my grief, is I just steamrolled right over it. With my mom, I wasn't working. I wasn't at a corporate job. And it's like it just overtook me like a big, huge wave. And I just got caught in that surf and tumbled around. And it was 2 years before I finally could bring myself to open that book. And when I did, I felt this, like, on that day, it wasn't like a long thing, but on that day, I felt like something just lighten up and this weight come off my shoulders. And I recognized it as having shifted from the active grieving process to a new phase where I could tolerate the loss of her.
Today's guest is Suzanne Rico, and she is a journalist, and she is an Emmy Award winner, and she is a new podcaster who has really gone on this deeply personal and, dare I say, transformative journey following the death of her mother and discovering her mother's memoir that was partially finished. This episode really covers kind of the impact of Suzanne uncovering her family's complex history in Nazi Germany, and you'll definitely want to hear this. She takes us through an emotional roller coaster of discovering her grandfather's involvement in World War II and how piecing together her mother's unfinished memoir led to this beautiful path of self-discovery, understanding, reconciliation, all culminating in the release of a very popular podcast now called The Man Who Calculated Death. So make sure after this episode, you go find that show and you listen to all the episodes that are out. I promise you, this is an episode that you don't want to miss. So make sure you listen to the full episode. And I appreciate you. I appreciate Suzanne. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Suzanne Rico.
I'm Matt Gilhooly, and this is The Life Shift, candid conversations about the pivotal moments that have changed lives forever.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Life Shift podcast. I am here with Suzanne. Hello.
Hi, nice to be here.
Well, thank you for joining me, and thank you for being a part of the Life Shift podcast. It has been quite a journey for me, and I just never knew I needed it, and here we are.
Isn't that strange how life can sometimes serve up exactly what you need, and you're like, wait a minute, I did? Yeah.
Yeah, and this podcast started as a school assignment. I did like a bonus master's degree during the pandemic. I got my MBA when I was in my 20s, and here in my 40s, I was like, well, it's really boring here locked up at home, so I'm going to do another master's degree. And I just took a podcasting class, and this was an assignment, and 164 episodes later, here we are.
That's amazing. And I'm not interviewing you, although I am a news broadcaster and reporter, so I'm going to have to read up more on your life, how you came up with this concept, because I think it's really, really cool.
Well, thank you. And I will tell you, because there are probably people listening for the first time, listening to your story, or they know you, or they feel connected to you. And the Life Shift podcast, besides starting as a school assignment, the theme of it starts from my own personal experience. When I was 8, my mom was killed in a motorcycle accident. And at the time, my parents were divorced. They lived states apart. I lived with my mom full time, was visiting my dad at the time, and he sat me down and had to tell me that my mom had died in that accident. And at that moment, my life splintered from what it was supposed to be, or what we all thought it was going to be, to this new version that no one had any idea what to do. New school, new state, new house, never going back to my own bed again kind of thing. And growing up, this was the late 80s, early 90s. Nobody was really talking about grief or mental health, let alone for a kid. Kids bounce back, those kind of things. And behind the scenes, I always wondered if other people had these line in the sand type moments where, like, one minute to the next, everything's different. Now that I'm older, I realize we have lots of those. And, it's interesting to talk about them. But really, that's where the life shift comes from. And I'm just so honored to be able to talk to people about all these different life shift moments in their lives. And yours is totally different than something I would experience. But I bet there's a lot of pieces of your story that I'll be able to relate to, and a lot that other people listening will be able to relate to. And that's what's so beautiful about storytelling.
Exactly. I was just going to say that in telling my story, which, has some pretty dark themes, I have been shocked at the people that say like, "Oh my gosh, I get it." Like, and I'm kind of gun shy about like, what's the reaction going to be when I tell people that I have this grandfather who made a wonder weapon, a super secret super weapon for Adolf Hitler. Are they going to hate me? And really, people have been so encouraging and supportive. And I love that because I never expected that either.
Yeah, that's tricky too. I think, now that you've given away the whole plot here, no, I'm just kidding. Uh,
Spoiler
it's
alert.
it's tricky because there's a lot of conversations that we should be having, but we don't have because we're afraid that other people are going to think certain things of us, or connect your ancestors history to you, like all these
Mhm.
things that we grew up thinking we can't share this. Like for me, I wasn't allowed to be sad because I was a boy, right? Like I wasn't allowed to cry because boys don't cry. And you grow up
Mhm.
and then you assume that for so long. And now all I want to do is talk to people about feelings, and like the fact that I can be a full human and have all the emotions and those kind of things. And so I totally understand your story where you're like, these really bad things happened in my lineage, and we'll talk the details about that in a
Yeah.
second, and then wonder like, are people going to assign that to me? But no, it's so important that you talk about it because we don't want it to happen again. We don't want more people, like we don't want more of these things to happen. We don't want other little boys to not be able to cry and then grow up and feel like they can't be a fully formed human. So I love that you're putting this story out there. We're going to talk about it in this episode, but I think kudos to you. No matter
Thank
what
you.
the response is, I hope that you absorb those pieces and feel really good about what you're doing.
Thank you. I'm getting there. It's a slow learning experience.
Well, I think it is for all of us. Yeah. So before we get into that particular story, you kind of hinted at it a little bit, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about who you are in this day and age. Who are you?
Yeah.
What do you represent?
I love the way you said that because it's in this day and age. So for years I had this like identity of who I was, and I was a newscaster and reporter, right? I mean, that's what I did my whole career. It's what I based my identity around. And I've been out of it for 10 years now and sort of casting around a little bit, like what am I going to do now? Like once that I decided to leave that business, I didn't really know who I was or who I should be. And so I think I spent some years just trying to find something else that really fulfilled me and made me happy. And then my mom died, which did not make me happy, but it sort of bequeathed me this legacy that became a passion project for me and took up the next 6 years of my life. So like I would say that I'm a journalist first and foremost. I have been lucky enough to work in several mediums, and now I am in the podcast medium for the first time. And as somebody who's going to be 60 in, oh my God, 2 months, how is that possible? I feel like I'm so lucky to have found this at that age. Like I am really feeling, I think for the first time in my life, super fulfilled, really challenged, right? Like you went and got a master's degree during COVID. I started working on this podcast because I needed something for my mind. And, I've become, I think, pretty good at it. And I think I will do more and more of these projects. And as we were talking about just a little while ago, like when you put out these passion projects that are personal, you take a risk, right? And you have to be ready for whatever response you're going to get. So as I go forward with it, I'm like half terrified, half excited. There needs to be a new word for that, Matt. We need to come up with a word for what it is to be excited and terrified at the same time, because that's very much how I feel. You asked who I am. I'm a mom of two. I have a great husband. I have a beautiful black lab named Blueberry. If I didn't mention those things, you couldn't get a full idea of who I am, because I'm not just an obsessed journalist trying to tell a story. I have a really full, beautiful life, and I'm so grateful for it.
Yeah. I mean, I love that transition for you. And I love that you're finding passion. I think you probably grew up thinking this as well. I know I did. You thought like a certain number age was old, right? And like you couldn't do anything new after that. For me, it was 32 because that's how old my mom was. So I thought
Mm.
she was old because I was 8, like she was old and I was not going to do anything. And then I turned, 33 and I was like, what do I do now? But I love that, like, you're showing that you can find all these fun things that you can do at any age. And it's just a number, right?
It is just a number. And here's the one thing that really gets to me is when people talk about, like, oh, my third act, it's the third act. It's like, how many, you can have as many acts as you want. You can have as many life shifts as you want. You just have to be it's staying flexible. And obviously it's great if you can stay flexible physically, but mentally you have to stay flexible and like, learn new things. And I don't want to think of this. I refuse to think of this as my third act. It's just my next act. And I can't wait to see where it's going to take me.
Yeah. Before we get into your story, do you find it hard to, because I would imagine as a TV personality, if you will, or on the news or doing what you were doing, there's a big performative nature to that. And do you find it hard to shed some of the performative nature when you're focused on like these more passion projects or things about you? Or do you feel like it has to be perfect? I don't know. You understand where I'm going? Like, I feel like,
I think there's two sides of where you're going. I mean, the performative nature of my job, I've really shed all of that. Like, my favorite thing to do is to come down and sit in my pajamas in front of my computer and work. Maybe I'll put a baseball hat on if I got to go walk the dog. So that was a big life shift for me, of going from, wearing suits, heels, makeup, hair. Like, this is as good as it's ever going to get. I just don't really care anymore. But
that's
there's
great.
also, yeah, and that feels really good. But there was another part of that I wanted to address before I got into just the looks. And maybe it's just that, getting older, I just don't care that much anymore what people think of me. Like that, there's a lot of freedom in that.
I agree. The older I get, the less I just put it all out there. It's easier to put it out there and then not worry about it.
It is. And guess what? If you don't like it, you can scroll. Like, like I
Exactly.
don't know. I used to worry so much about what everybody thinks. And people used to tell me your lipstick color is wrong, and why do you have bangs, or da, 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 pick. And it's just like, whatever, you know, bring it on.
Glad you found this part of your life, and let's talk about your story. And I think the best way to do it is maybe paint the picture of your life leading up to kind of what we're going to center this conversation around today, and then we can go from there.
Okay. My mom grew up in Nazi Germany, right? As a child. And it was a story that she told to us in pieces when we were kids. And she told it because I think it was so damaging to her, the things that happened to her. She told it in like a fairy tale style, so that we really couldn't tell the difference between Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella or the Big Bad Wolf and the story that she told of, her city burning and her home burning in a terror bombing, or the day that her mother died in very violently and mysteriously. I'm not going to spoil it for the podcast, but at the age of 7. And so I didn't ever know about my own history. I didn't ever know about what she had gone through and who my grandfather was. And it wasn't until she died of her third cancer. She was diagnosed 3 times and she beat the first 2, and then the third one took her. It wasn't until she died that I realized that she had written this memoir, kind of half written it, and her last request really was that we finish this book for them, that my sisters and I finished this memoir. Well, what you're probably thinking is, how do you finish someone else's memoir, right? Like, that's really intimate and specific. And so, yeah, it wasn't easy. It kicked off this quest for me to understand my family history in Nazi Germany and my connection to kind of the worst parts of Nazi Germany, the death and destruction, the Holocaust. My grandfather's flying bomb killed thousands of people in England. There were so many bad consequences of that. And I just dove into it head first to try to learn everything that I possibly could. So that moment, or it wasn't the moment when my mom died. It was that started off sort of this balancing point where I knew I was going to change and fall into another life, but it took a while because I was so mired in grief.
Yeah. Well, so you didn't know that she had written down this memoir at all?
She had like told us that, yeah, I'm writing this memoir, but I had never seen it. I didn't know what state it was in. I didn't really know like what she was writing about. And when I was a kid, also, my mom had these really, really severe panic attacks and
Mm,
post-traumatic
makes sense.
stress, tons. Yes. But like you said, in 1960s and 70s, post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't even a term, right? That didn't come till 1984. So there was no dialogue around it. There was, and she would take us kids like shopping for back to school, and then halfway through our shopping trip she would run out like in a panic, like like barely breathing, and we just thought she was weird. We were just like, oh, mom's freaking out again. So it's been such an amazing experience and a difficult experience, but part of it is that I got to know my mom so much better in death. Isn't
Yeah.
that weird?
I don't know that it is. I think that a lot of times we just, like you said, you just thought she was weird. You just kind of like, we
Yeah.
just make these assumptions. We push things aside. We don't ask questions, especially in the time period that you grew up. Same here. Like, I didn't ask all the questions that maybe this version of me would have asked, or the questions that you asked as you were going down that road, like
I wish I could go back and talk to her about it, Matt. And that's what I would say to any listener out there right now. Like, talk to your
ask the
loved ones,
questions.
your parents, ask your questions, because as you and I both know, the opportunity gets taken away from you, and you can't ever go back and recreate that. I wish that I had said to her, Mom, I'm so sorry. Just had some empathy. Like, I'm so sorry for what you went through. But by the time I learned about it, it was too late.
Yeah, and I mean, and maybe in this fantasy version of us being able to do all these things, she wouldn't have been able to answer you.
Maybe,
Maybe that stress,
maybe.
maybe that trauma, maybe her safety was telling you these stories in a way that was palatable, if you can't, like, if
Oh,
you will.
for sure. For sure. It was for her, I call it a defense mechanism, right? So her defense mechanism was to certainly not glorify is not the word I'm looking for, but like animate in a way that made it seem like it happened to somebody else.
And it was probably her way of processing. I would imagine there's some kind of therapy that does similar things in a way.
Yeah.
And maybe she was trying to self soothe in a way and tell you the stories of, like, maybe I can dip my toes, let you all know that something came before me or in my childhood. But yeah, it's so interesting to then find or be able to read this memoir. How long did it take you to like crack it open and read it for the first time? And then how long did it take for you to like take action?
Great question, because I could not even look at it for 2 years. I could not even look at a picture of her. I could not even think about reading her memoir. It was like every time I saw like her handwriting on something, I would just like, I would lose it. And, my dad died when I was 56, and it was a very different grieving experience because I was younger. I was working really hard. I was like, okay, I'm going back to work. And that's how I dealt with my grief, is I just steamrolled right over it. With my mom, I wasn't working. I mean, I wasn't at a corporate job. And it's like it just overtook me like a big huge wave, and I just got caught in that surf and tumbled around. And And it was 2 years before I finally could bring myself to open that book. And when I did, I felt this, like, on that day, it wasn't like a long thing, but on that day, I felt like something just lighten up and this weight come off my shoulders. And I recognized it as as having shifted from the active grieving process to a new phase where I could tolerate the loss of her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where I could handle it, and where she felt with me. And she hadn't felt with me. That was one of the things, Matt, that the grief was so terrific, because I would like look for her somewhere out there in heaven or the universe or wherever you want to believe our loved ones go. And I could not find any trace of her. And that broke me. That broke my heart.
It's a lot of pressure to put on yourself, though.
I was just like, Mom, come on, where are you? You're around somewhere, right? Show me that you're here. And finally, when I opened that memoir, I was like, oh, there you are. And it's never been the same. I've just gone up and up and up from there. And now I feel her with me every moment, really.
First of all, I think your story about grief, or your comments about grief, are so important to share, because I think people assume that there's like one way to grieve, or like you pointed out, there's one way that Suzanne will grieve. There's one way that Matt will grieve. It's not true, because you had a different grieving experience when you lost your father than to when you lost your mother. It took me 20 years to, what I would say, grieve my mother. And then when my grandmother got sick, she became my best friend when my mom died. She kind of took the mother figure over. And I felt like I knew how to do it. Like, I had that final conversation with her. I sat her down, said everything I ever needed to say that I probably would have shared at the eulogy to her face, and had that conversation. But it's because of the first version,
Yeah.
and so I think it's important that we share our grief journeys, and we tell people, like, no, it sucked for 2 years. It sucked for 2 decades, whatever it was. And I couldn't do anything I wanted to do. And I felt like I needed to be a certain place at a certain time. But no, it's our own journey. It's so important. But I'm sorry that you maybe felt like it was not great for you as well.
It was just, yeah, I would
Do
say
you
that
look back on it as like
I
maybe
look,
something you needed?
no, I look back
Okay.
on it as just a really, like, I don't really recognize that woman, because I felt like for everybody else, I was performing. Surprise, surprise, I could do that, right? And I was like, oh, okay, I'm good. And when inside, I just felt completely like blank and empty and heartbroken. Like, it wasn't just this like dull nothing feeling. It was this really visceral, like ripping grief. And I felt like, because of my kids, because of all the people that surround me and love me and look to me, I felt like I had to, look like I had it together when I really didn't. So for me, it was such a relief to get out of that. I can't even tell you, I'm still grateful for it today, because I remember so vividly how awful it was.
When you were saying that, and this is me making assumptions here on my podcast, do you think that the way you performed in those 2 years was similar to the way that your mom kind of approached things when she was raising you and sharing those
God,
stories?
where are you getting these questions? That is an amazing question, because my mom and I were so similar. And my mom and I both had this she had this performative quality about, like, we will entertain and we will put on our smiley faces and we will, make it all sound great. She did that with her story, and I did that. Like, I remember when my parents got divorced when I was 12, people would say, like, oh, well, isn't that awful? Aren't you sad? I'd be like, no, 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 I'm fine. It's good. I'm totally fine. Let's just move on. When my dad died, oh God, do you want to take some time off work? No, 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 God, no. Let's just go. We both had that sort of like, don't look at it too deeply. Just turn and move forward, put one foot in front of another, and you'll walk out of whatever trouble you were. So I think, going back to those 2 years of really deep grief, I think that's the first time I ever really got mired in something that I couldn't get myself out of.
Yeah. But you were still performing for everyone else.
Oh yeah, I was. Well, yes. And then I would hit the deck every once in a while. Those closest to me saw the sort
Good.
of undoings every once in a while. And I would say that they were good if they had led to like a gradual healing, but it didn't feel like that. It really
Yeah.
did feel like I kind of healed from one day to the next. And it was that book.
Well, I think that's important. I don't mean good like
No,
that
I
they were so
know.
happy to see that, but I think it's important for people to see us not at our best, to know that like we're fully human and we're experiencing life, and it's not always easy and sunshines and rainbows and all the things that come with it. But in any case, I love that that reminder of your mother when you were ready for it came in the way it did and kind of unleashed this next part of your journey in the fact that like now you have this half finished or however much finished book that your mom wrote. How the hell do you write someone else's memoir if only the stories you know are the fantastical versions of them that your mom gave you early on?
Well, I don't know if you've followed along with the math, but she died in 2013 and it's now 2024 and I'm just getting to the end of it. So it was a long process. I couldn't start it at the beginning. And then when I finally did start it, even though I very much felt my mom with me, urging me on, being very positive and happy about that, I felt like I can't do this. Like there were so many times, Matt, where I just got to a point where I was like, there's she's not around to ask. I don't understand what she's talking about. I don't understand what my grandfather did. I mean, like I found a telegram from Hermann Goering, who is like Adolf Hitler's number 2 in command, that was to my grandfather congratulating him on this flying bomb, on the world's first cruise missile, because it had just destroyed a church in England. And I'm like, oh my God, like, wait a minute. Okay, stop. Like, I need to know more about this before I can even start to do that book. So that was the sort of inception of the podcast version, which is my narrative, right? That's my narrative. I don't know if we want to skip to that, but I realized that there's no way that I could finish that book until I educated myself as much as I could about the larger history around it, about what my grandfather did. And that took years and years. And once I finished that, I went back to her book and I built in her words as a child and tried to braid it into the larger history, right? Because it needed context. That was one thing that she didn't put in, is the context. And you were talking about World War II Germany, right? That's a pretty amazing, terrible context.
And how old was she when she left
She was
there?
75, but she was very young 75. I feel like it's always like, oh, 75, who cares? And I'm like, no, she went too early.
But did she move to the States or did she live in
She,
Germany?
I'm sorry. Yes, she left Germany at 11.
Okay.
She emigrated to the United States when she was 11. Yeah. And then she just pushed all of her German heritage to the past and looked to the future and became an American. That's like was her goal. Talk about a life shift, I mean, her life shift there was total. She learned English in 3 months.
Yeah.
She became an English professor. She wrote 2 best-selling books. Like, okay, Mom.
Yeah, no pressure on you now to finish that up.
Exactly.
Before you tell me your story of like digging into that and how you created your narrative and finished her book, how did your sisters have a similar experience to you when your mom passed and with this memoir, and was there an involvement in this or?
So my sister Stephanie, my older sister Stephanie, she is my co-pilot, I would call her, in the podcast. She has worked on a version of the memoir as well, like a version that is sort of just what my mom was writing and without the context that I'm trying to put it in. So she has been intimately involved in all steps of it. My younger sister Simone, she actually read pieces of my mom's memoir for the podcast. and she's a beautiful pianist, and she did the classical piano music that I use throughout the podcast. So she was involved in that way. As far as like grieving experiences, it's strange because I'm so close to my sisters, but we all three really had different experiences with that.
I think it's normal. I don't think
Yeah.
it's too strange. I think, we're all individuals at the end of the day. So,
Yeah.
I think we process them in different ways. I was just curious if like if they were like, I'm going to read it tomorrow after she died, or if it was a longer period in which
They were more able to do all of that than I was, for sure. Like we did this memorial video for my mom, after she died, and I saw it at her funeral, and I did not see it again for maybe 7 years, because every time I turned it on, I would cry so hard that I couldn't see it anyway. So I'd just turn it off.
Well, fair. I think that's fine. It's curious how we think that everyone that has a similar relationship with someone might grieve the same way. And it was like, I was the first one to like thumbs up grieve my grandmother in a way that felt very positive. And my father and his brother didn't grieve in the same way, because this was really the first loved one of theirs. I mean, they loved my mom, but she wasn't blood related to them.
Right.
This was the first loss for them. So they didn't really know how to approach it in the same way that I was like, I'm a pro, like I can do it. So
Yeah, wow.
it makes a lot of sense. So tell me, what was that like? What was the first step where you had to start to create this context? Because now you're finding these letters, you're finding telegrams, you're finding all this stuff that like you probably normally would read in like a history book or like in a museum or something. And these are in your personal artifacts.
Yeah.
What is that
Well,
like?
once I realized that I had this really amazing archive of family history, I went to my aunts, right? Because I'm a journalist, I was like, okay, what's my source here? What's my source? Like, how am I going to figure this out? So I basically went to my aunts, who at that time were 88 and 90 years old. And I said, look, guys, you need to help me. You need to be my guides into the past. My mom is not here. You need to explain these things to me as best you can. And boy, Matt, both of them are pack rats, and they brought out more stuff, and just like letters about when my grandfather joined the Nazi party in 1937, and a ski binding that he invented in 1955, and like they had so much stuff. And so I really had them sort of take me step by step, guide me into the past, and give me as many narratives as they could. And they're amazing at 88 and 90. They were all there. And what I found was that when you go that far into the past, really anywhere into the past, 3 years, and you talk to different people about what they remember, it's different, right? So my mom had a different story than my Aunt Heidi, had a different story than my Aunt Trouty. They remembered their father in different ways. And so what I wanted to do with my version of it is I wanted to make it my story, right? I didn't want to tell my aunt's story. That's not fair. I didn't want to tell my mom's story. I didn't want to tell I wanted to tell my story about finding out the truth about my family. And I think that's what it turned out to be. It's this investigation / exploration / adventure / quest to understand this time in history that was really important, and where world history and my history collide, right? I mean,
That's fascinating.
it was kind of cool. It was really cool, actually. And I think I describe it in the podcast this way. At some point, the really blurry pieces missing puzzle that was my family ancestry began to feel a little bit more like a map, and something that I could actually put my finger on and start to trace the family steps that led to me, being born in 1965 in Cupertino, California.
Yeah.
So it really turned from like a crappy puzzle that I couldn't figure out how to put together to a roadmap from the past to the future.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating in itself, to be able to uncover that. I mean, I watched like Finding Your Roots like on PBS, and you kind of hear all these things. Your aunts were basically
Yes.
the archivists with all the things that they had for you.
Yep.
But how also, like, cool enough if you're understanding your ancestry, but yours is complicated because now you have this to deal with. Does any part of you start to, like, absorb that? Do you feel like, is there a guilt that comes with it? Is there a shame? Like, how does someone discovering more of this for the first time kind of process that?
Well, that's another question that I absolutely love, and you're dead on, because I had never thought about concepts of generational or collective guilt before. Why would I think about that? I had never thought about what responsibility I might have as the descendant of a Nazi scientist who made a weapon of mass destruction. What responsibility do I have, not for World War II or for the Holocaust, but to somehow contribute to solving? You can't solve the problem, it already happened, but you know what I'm saying? What responsibility do I have to make sure that never happens again? To speak out, to tell my story. So I had to wrestle with those issues straight up at the beginning, because once we went to Germany, my sister and I went through Germany, we followed our family path physically through Germany. I realized that there was this shame and pride simultaneously battling within my heart, right? So you go to a museum, or you go and you talk to somebody like who knows about my grandfather. Like I talked to this professor of armament and aviation in Germany, and he's like, your grandfather was one of the most brilliant engineers in Germany at that time, and he was a race pilot and he flew some of the earliest airplanes and designed some of the earliest airplanes. And you feel like, yay, oh my gosh, that's amazing, like I'm the descendant of this brilliant guy.
Right.
And then we went to an underground concentration camp called Mittelbau-Dora, where slave laborers had to build my grandfather's bombs. They assembled them there, right? And you hear that 20,000 people died doing that, and you're like, oh shit, I can never be proud of that. So there was a lot of conflicting emotions. And I will tell you that I went into this, specifically the podcast project, with two goals. And one was that I did not want to try to redeem my grandfather, and I did not want to try to condemn him, right? So I didn't want that to be like, oh, let's just make him evil, or let's just make him good, right?
It's
None of us
complex.
are that black and white. We're shades of gray, as he was. He was a very complicated, complex, the man of his time, of the 20s and 30s. He had a lot of those, misogynistic. He was very arrogant, narcissistic, that kind of thing. But he also, he saved his family in the aftermath of World War II. He kept them together, 5 kids, and somehow survived.
It's hard to reconcile something like that, I would imagine.
It kind of makes me sick a little bit to talk about it, because I'm afraid sometimes that people are going to say, like, oh, you're just trying to make him sound good, or redeem him, or wipe the slate clean. And I'm like, no, it's never been my goal. And I hope people see in the podcast that I'm trying to understand. I'm not trying to make judgment.
No, and I think that's what we all should be doing, is trying to understand.
Wouldn't that be nice?
So one, we don't do it again. And, and we don't let these things happen. We take them out of the shadows, right? We take them out of the places that people hide them, like your mother, to protect herself, hid a lot of things from everyone because it was too traumatic for her and she didn't want to share that. And she probably had some shame that came along with it. And so, I think it's great that first of all, I think it's great that you went into it with this intention. Like, you're not trying to go one way or the other. You're just trying to paint the picture. You're just trying to show that this was a complicated human being who maybe thought he was making the right decisions. Maybe he didn't. We don't really know, right?
Well, that's the thing, Matt, is that you can try to put yourself in his shoes, and you can try to say, well, here's what I would have done. in 1939 when the war was starting, and you're an aeronautical engineer, and they come to you and they say, hey, can you build this fighter plane or wonder weapon or whatever, and you have 5 kids and they give you a paycheck. Like, it's really hard to armchair quarterback from the future. So do I wish he'd made some different choices? Certainly I do. Do I know that I would have made different choices? That's where it becomes a little bit more hazy.
No, and we can't answer for people that aren't us. We really
No.
can't, do those kind of things. But it's something you said about kind of how this trauma could pass through generations, and kind of this ownership of some kind of shame or something that comes along with it. And part of me made me think of someone on the podcast talked to me about epigenetics. Have you
Mm.
talked at all about that or thought about that?
Yeah, my sister knows about all of that stuff, right?
Yeah, and something in that something that maybe your mom's trauma kind of gets buried in that DNA and kind of passes on to the next generations, and you don't really, maybe it's a little bit more subtle, maybe it's whatever it is, and maybe that is that connection of how that the way you performed through grief and those kind of things similar to your mom. I wonder if
Yeah.
part of that relates to how that passes down. I mean, I think I got some of my grandmother's trauma from her terrible childhood passed, through. And so I always think about these things of how, like, we can be connected to these people. Yes, you can look at DNA and of course we're connected in that way, but some other things might have come along with it, and that's how that kind of feeds into you.
Yeah, I think that is certainly, it's an interesting premise, and I also think that, like, just by being in physical proximity to people that we love, our parents growing up, like, her trauma certainly leaked into me somehow, even though I think she tried not to let it do that. But now it feels, the things that happened to her and that time feels really alive to me. It's really a weird feeling. It's hard for me to express, but, like, my grandmother died in 1945 at the age of 41. I never met her. My grandfather, I never met him. But it's weird because I swear to God, I know them. Like, I have gotten to know them. And it's like, as much as you can get into the mind of a dead man, I feel like I have. And it's kind of a cool but kind of eerie feeling,
But
It
you've probably
is.
done a lot more work than a lot of people do about for their grandparents, or, those kind of things to get to know them. So I imagine a lot of that seeps in. But did you do any what you might consider redemptive type things in this journey? Like, did you do anything that you felt like, I need to do this to either ease my soul or help my mom's soul or whatever in that journey?
I don't know that you're talking about redemption in the same way that what I'm thinking of as soon as you ask that question. But one of the things that was super, super important to me was to go and to connect with one of the Holocaust survivors that worked in the underground camp where my grandfather's bombs were assembled. And it took me 3 years to find one. And not because they weren't findable, but because every survivor group that I reached out to declined to help me. Because as soon as I told them who I was, I was the granddaughter of the scientist who made the V1 flying bomb, they were like, no, no, no. Like, that didn't feel comfortable for them to be putting the two of us together. But for me, it wasn't a complete story without that side of it. And I feel like even in my family, like, growing up and as I tried to learn more, like, everybody wanted to sweep that part of it under the rug. That's it's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable, it's like, oh, genius engineer, great. So I felt like to tell only that part of the story without the darkest part was not fair to anybody that would listen to the podcast. It wasn't fair to myself. So that was just really, really important to me. And I guess maybe redemption, as soon as you said that, somehow this man gave me this gift. And I don't characterize it as redemption, but I characterize it as like a lesson in humanity, in that he let me into his world, into his life, into his story. I sat there with him. I think it's one of the best interviews I've ever done. And I've been doing it for a long time. And I think it's super powerful. And Oscar, his name's Oscar, Oscar was able to find, I mean, this is a guy who 40 of his family members were gassed at Auschwitz. He was able to find some empathy for my grandfather. And that just completely blew me away and did give me like, okay, this is what I've been working so hard for. This is why I felt like I had to do this story, because it's going to connect me to these people on the other side that make my experience wider and deeper and open my heart in ways that I would have never had my heart opened if I hadn't done this.
Yeah.
He's amazing.
Maybe the approach was this, I'm looking for redemption, but what you got was much richer and much better than any kind of redemption for your family line.
Yeah, I just did not expect it.
Yeah.
And it was
And that's the best.
Yeah, it was a benediction of sorts that he gave to me. And I feel, like if he could understand, then certainly it was worth me trying to understand.
Did you feel different walking out of that interview?
Yeah. I mean, Oscar and I have become friends. I just flew to St. Louis for his 94th birthday to celebrate that with him. And it's interesting to me because not only do I do his story in the podcast, but I'm working on a project to tell the story of Oscar and me, of our friendship, because it's such an unlikely friendship, right? And so how I felt when I came away from that wasn't like the normal interviews that I usually do, where I'm like, oh, okay, I just interviewed, the wife whose husband was just murdered or whatever, and now I can walk away and forget about it. I felt like, oh my God, I have like new friends, and it almost feels like family. Like Oscar's wife always says, I'll be your mom. I'll be your mom. She's German, so she says that. And I think to myself, I got this whole new dimension to my life.
And there's something to be said that you chose to do that too, because I think a lot of people wouldn't choose to do that because they're afraid.
I was so nervous.
But that's so strong of you to put that down and walk into that conversation. I mean, very well could have screamed at you, blamed you, done all these things.
Yeah.
Rightfully so. I mean,
yes. You're freaking me out right now, honestly, because you're saying like things that I say to people. And I'm like, wait, how does he know? Because I know you haven't listened to the podcast or spoken to me before. But I say that in my podcast because I'm waiting at his front door. And it's like, knock, knock, knock. Wait. And the time is click. And I'm like, oh my God, did he change his mind? Is he going to come out and be like, get off my front porch? And I say in there, and if he's still angry after all these years, rightfully so. So yes, I had a tremendous amount of fear and trepidation and anxiety leading up to that moment. And then as soon as he opened the door and I looked at him and I was like, oh, it's going to be okay. Like I just saw it in his eyes. I saw it in his eyes that he did not harbor hate or resentment or anything toward me personally.
This journey of discovering and figuring out this map of your life and the lives that came before you, has it changed you?
It has changed me. I think it's broadened certainly my knowledge. Like some people laugh because when we get to talking about World War II, I'm like, like Rain Man or something. Like I'm just like, oh, and then in 1939, and I've got these dates and that dates. And I mean, don't get me started on like the BF-109 warplane or the V-1 flying bomb or the HE-280 turbojet. It's like I have so it's expanded my breadth of knowledge, certainly my understanding and love of history. I'm obsessed. I just think that history, and by the way, you could sit here and tell me a little bit about your history and I would ask you 1,000 questions. Like I want to know everybody's history because everybody has a story, right? If you just dig a little bit in the back of somebody's, closet, you will find something worth talking about. So in that way it did. There's a little bit of a negative connotation to what I want my answer to be in terms of how it changed me. I feel like I'm a little bit more of a, not a fearful person, but I'm afraid of what's going to happen from this. Like, I describe it as I can feel this storm brewing out there now that my podcast is going to come out into the world. And I can't tell if that storm is going to be a beautiful storm or a terrible storm, or maybe a combination of both. And so I don't love the anxiety that it's brought into my life, because when you have the blessing or the privilege of telling other people's stories, it's a big responsibility. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel that responsibility very, very heavily. And so it's changed me in a way of like, God, this is the most important thing I've ever done. And what if I just let everybody down? What if
You
I,
haven't.
I
Even before it
hope
comes
not.
out, you haven't.
You
You've done the
think?
work. Yeah.
I
I
have done
mean,
the work.
you've done the work, not just saying that like you did work because you did work, but you did the work that so many people would choose not to do.
Yeah.
So many people would walk away. That was in the past. Let's forget about that. We don't need to do it. You did the work. And it's a personal story. It's not what you reported on the news before, right? Like this is something you're connected to. So I see the fear. I accept the fear. I see that you have this trepidation of it. People aren't going to like it. People are going to love it. People are going to, like it's just how life goes, right? People aren't going to love everything.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important because you showed up when so many people wouldn't show up.
Yeah. Well,
And I
thank
think,
you.
you're helping the world learn more. You're learning more in the process. So
Yes.
I hope it's a beautiful storm, but I think you did the work.
We will see. I mean, that's the interesting part, right? It's going to come out. It's going to be what it will be. And frankly, Matt, it doesn't do me much good to worry about what it's going to be, because the wheels are in motion. So that's what I tell myself when I get really anxious about it. I just say, you've been working for years to let this fly and let it out of the nest and let it go where it needs to go. And hopefully my kind of deepest hope is that maybe it could be used as a learning tool. Maybe it can be used as a learning for even for middle schoolers, like to open their broad, because World War II is not in color for middle schoolers or even high schoolers. And I think maybe this can bring some of that, to life for them so that they understand it.
Well, one thing you said, I hope it can be a learning tool. My opinion of it, regardless of the topic, I think there is such a humanity learning tool in what you've done. Because I think people, whether they're interested in the actual story, will think differently about talking to their parents, will think differently about asking questions about their family history. Well, like I think that's going to encourage a lot of people to do similar things. Maybe they're not going to go down the depths that you did, but maybe they're going to be more open with their family. So I think there's a wider implication of what you're putting out into the world beyond just the story you're sharing, if that makes
I
any
hope
sense.
so. I hope that if anybody can go like, oh, I'm going to ask grandma, what it was like when she was a girl growing up in, 1940s United States or wherever, Japan or whatever, like what was it like? And I guarantee that answer will surprise you. It's like and I just love older people because they do have so many great stories to tell. It's so cool.
Do you ever sit back and think about how this is going to be hard to word, but your mother's passing and your mother's cancer and your mother's end gave you this weird gift of this journey that you've been on since? Do you look at any of that weird silver line? It's really hard for me to say out loud, as you can see, but do you see any of that as like almost like a gift that she left for you?
Oh, huge, huge, absolutely huge. It's such a huge gift because not only did my mom give me this tool to learn about my family ancestry, but it's something I can pass down to my kids, right? And I don't think we ever really think about that. We're so busy with our lives and being parents or being kids or being workers or whatever we're doing, that we don't really think about, like, time will run out at some point to tell these stories and to pass them down. My kids are almost 17 and 19, and they didn't know anything about their family ancestry. And now, after years of listening to me putting this podcast together and talking about it, they talk about their great grandparents as if they know them. And by the way, it brings me no amount of happiness and peace to know that when I'm gone, they can put that podcast on and hear my voice,
Yeah, they could put this
and
podcast on.
they can put this podcast on and they can hear my voice and your voice. And, I think
I love that.
for, at least for me, Matt, as a mother, I just feel like it's going to help me live on in their minds and lives and hearts. And my mom lives on in me. They say that we only really die when no one remembers to say our name.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is really true.
Yeah. Here comes a weird statement from my head, but I think of like how yeah, I do this. It's my podcast. I can do whatever I want.
Exactly.
But, you think of how your mother trickled out these stories to you in ways that were not full. They were not
Mm-hmm.
complete. They were not a way. And I see that as such like had she been really descriptive and had written everything out, you wouldn't have had this journey of understanding as challenging as it was. This whole thing unfolded in such a way because your mother chose to do the things she did in the way that she did. And I always love to look, if that hadn't happened, all these other dots, we wouldn't be talking right now.
Right. Well, the whole premise of your podcast are these like little life shifts, like where we hit the fork in the road and how other people's forks in the road affect our forks in the road. And then, it keeps going and going and going.
So fun to play that game.
It is so fun. And I think to myself, there's another aspect of that I think is interesting to mention here is, I was a newscaster and a reporter for a long, long time, but I have never done anything like this. I talked in a minute 30, 2-minute pieces packaged for the evening news or the morning news. This is 9 episodes, 35 to 40 minutes an episode. It is a sweeping epic that goes from 1899 to United States in the 1950s with the space program. It's an epic story. And I had to teach myself to tell that kind of story. I had to teach myself to edit. Because I did the rough cuts. I had to teach myself how to understand code and like crazy things that I never wanted to know before. And I probably half of it I still don't want to know. But like I came away from this with these skills that I would have never had if I hadn't done this project. And that to me, I'm like, okay, that's what we were talking about earlier in this podcast. It's like the learning, the evolving, the coming to a different point in your life where you're like, God, I never thought I would be sitting here editing. And guess what? I'm a pretty damn good editor. That's cool.
No, I'm the same way. If my mom hadn't died, we would not be having this conversation. Yeah. I would not be the person that I am today. I probably wouldn't be as empathetic. I probably wouldn't be able to ask questions of people that maybe more normal people shy away from, And so all these things, it's hard to say that I'm grateful for the experiences because of this really challenging moment. And it's kind of the same for you is you had a really hard grief period, but when you opened that book and the light kind of shined on your face, like reading rainbow kind of thing. Yeah. And you were able to kind of go into this new journey for yourself. What's the name of your podcast? I don't think we said it.
The Man Who Calculated Death.
Well, there you go. That's going to get a lot of downloads just because of the name of it.
The Man Who Calculated Death. Yeah. And it comes out November 6th on Wondery Plus.
That's awesome. So by the time this episode comes out, it'll have been out for a little bit. Yes. Hopefully most of the episodes are out by now. You are able to go on Wondery Plus and check this out.
Yes, I hope so. And so Wondery, I'll say this because it's coming out in January, but Wondery Plus has a 3-month exclusive on it. And then it will go over to a free ad-based
Perfect.
Where you have to listen to the ads, but it'll be free. So, if you don't want to join,
It'll still
although I
be
hope you
out
will,
in some way. Yeah,
it'll still
definitely.
be out in some way, and you can, follow along. And I have a website at themanwhocalculateddeath.com where I have a lot of those archival materials that
That's
I'm going to be
awesome.
putting on as the
I love that.
episodes drop. So, yeah, deep dive.
So I love to wrap up these conversations with a question. And I'm wondering if this version of Suzanne sitting here talking about this, having completed the podcast, having, wherever you are on that memoir piece,
Close.
if you could go back to the Suzanne that was in the deep throes of that grief journey, can't really talk about your mom or read the book, you're looking for those signs. Is there anything you would want to tell her?
I guess I would want to say that I didn't need to go as deep as I went. Like, I wish that I could have found some of what you talk about with your grandmother, which was a real beauty in a passing. I think I could do that now, maybe, because you do learn from it. But it was almost like I felt like I had to go that deep to honor my mom and to show her how much I loved her. And that is not the case. So I've heard about people like you, and I've heard about, other friends have told me about, sitting with parents and holding their hands as they go. And it's a really beautiful moment. And they feel really, they grieve, but it's a much more positive experience than what I had. So I would want to tell her, like, don't hang your hat on having to go that deep, because she's with you. She loves you. You did everything you could do. There were no regrets. There were no unanswered questions. I got to ask. She battled cancer for 9 months, and we had all the conversations. We said everything we needed to say. And so I feel like I would say, you know, do your grieving, and then, I don't know, accept it. But then I think to myself, Matt, well, maybe I needed to do that in order to get to where I am. It's all this path that we're on that we can't see until we're down the road, and then we look back and we go, oh. Because if I had just sort of skipped off into the sunset, I probably wouldn't have
Nope.
gone
You
as
wouldn't
deep
open
as
the
I
book
did.
in the same way. You wouldn't have gone on that same journey. I think it's interesting, but something you said, I loved what you said about you don't have to go that deep. You don't have to prove that you didn't say prove, but this is how
I
I
know what
took
you're
it my own
saying.
personally. You don't have to prove that you're the saddest person ever or you're so distraught that you cannot function, because I've felt that way. I've done that in my journeys. For 20 years trying to grieve my mom, I did it
Yeah,
all wrong. And I was like,
yeah.
oh, life sucks because my mom died, or I got this promotion because my mom's dead. Like it was just a lot of stupid things that I was doing to try to heal. But I thought that was really profound. You saying, like, there's nothing to prove. You don't
You
have
don't
to.
have to hang your hat on the fact of your mother's death, and, have it color everything
I
that
did.
you do. For 20 years. I'm sorry that it took you a long time. I feel maybe a little more grateful now that it only took me
Well,
two.
I was a kid. So
Yeah, but before I came to a realization that, hey, it's okay. Like, you're going to be all right. It just didn't feel that way before. So, yeah, I think that's part of what I would say to other people that have really difficult grieving experiences is, you know, you don't have to prove that you loved them so much by going to such a horrible dark space. That
but
doesn't
also
prove
honor
anything.
however you're feeling,
Yeah,
like, so
for
if you
sure.
do have those days, it's just part of the journey. And I think it's important to think about. But thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your story in this way and letting me ask weird questions and that.
I
I think
loved I
it's,
loved your questions. You would have been a great news person.
oh, thank you. I
Yeah,
can't do
interviewer.
1.5 minutes. I got to go long.
No, right.
If people want to connect with you or tell you their story, or how your story touched them, or listen to your podcast, or what's the best way to get in your orbit?
So the man who calculated death.com has a contact page, comes straight to me. So I will see everything that comes in there. It will also have links to the trailer and the episodes, that bonus content. I have a who's who page, so you can see pictures of like my grandfather and my mother and my sisters and and my aunties. My aunties are awesome. So that is probably the best way. And I just actually am, I just started that with this podcast, and I hope the website becomes like a repository for other people's stories too.
That's awesome. Yeah. Are you on the socials? Can people find you in those places?
Suzanne Rico on all of them. One word, SUZANNERICO.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing you and sharing your journey through grief and out of grief and doing the work that so many people might shy away from. So we really appreciate it. I hope this storm is a beautiful storm that comes out for you.
Knock on wood, right?
Yeah. And if it's not, that's okay too.
You know what? Duck and cover, right?
Duck and cover, grab your umbrella. Exactly.
Ride it out. Yeah.
There's always, the grass is going to grow and all the things are going to come after that. So I hope it's beautiful, but if it's not, that's okay too.
Well, thank you. I really, really have enjoyed this. This is great.
Well, thank you for being a part of this. And then everyone listening, thank you for listening. It just means a lot to me. If someone that you know needs to hear Suzanne's story or might be inspired by Suzanne's story, we'd love it if you share this episode with them. And if you're feeling really excited, maybe go to Apple Podcasts, give me a little rating review. Other than that,
I will.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. There you go. Follow Suzanne.
You can review The Man Who Calculated Death at the same time.
Exactly. Go and do both of that. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Thanks.
For more information, please visit www.thelifeshiftpodcast.com.